question from Anua Chakraborty. There's huge shocks to both the demand and supply side, right? It's the economy is getting buffeted by shocks from both sides. And the question of inflation versus deflation is on many people's minds, right? But given this winds from all directions, the overall pressure, do you see it inflationary or deflationary?
On the aggregate, it's difficult to say. It's quite likely. There are certain sectors of the economy which unquestionably, without doubt, are going to be facing very strong deflationary pressures. Okay, the hospitality industry is a case in point. And there's very little that one can do about that. But there are other segments of the economy. I mean, for instance, if the DBT is really successful and the government can actually do it properly, then happening. Now, other segments or other industries, what happens to their prices would really be determined by what is the dominant factor that is facing them. Is it demand or is it the supply problems? If it's a demand problem, you'll be looking at deflation. If it's a supply problem, you'll be looking at
In that connection, let me ask you about prices, specific prices, especially food price inflation, or terms of trade, more. So there's been fears about supply chain disruptions, especially during the lockdown, for food, and that has been a big worry. And practically, there's 100% support across the board for the government's decision to raise the food rations from 5 kgs to 10 kgs. I mean, I'm yet to hear somebody who grumbled about that one. Even Jean Drèze picked that out for praise. But the question is, how long does it continue? And I don't know if you'll agree with me. I mean, the FCI stocks being 3 times the buffer stocks norm has happened for a reason, right? Because the government basically overpurchases systematically to give income support to farmers. So if this outflow from FCI stocks, which has a compelling reason, to just feed people who are starving, but do you see some serious risk of the terms of trade moving against agriculture? That some sort of it may play up farm distress in 3-4 months down the line, food prices getting sort of lower relative to other prices. Is that a prospect we should keep an eye out for?
Parikshit, let me be very clear. From what I've been saying, if the stimulus package remains where it is, then you are really looking at terms of trade moving against agriculture quite strongly. If they can do the expanded DBT that you and I are talking about, then the situation can reverse. So much depends upon what the government does and what the government wishes to. But at the moment, as between loss of jobs among the poor on one hand and loss of incomes, therefore, a very incomplete and a very small DBT and large releases from food stocks is a complete recipe for farm prices, farmers' incomes actually, not farm prices, so much of farmers' incomes being adversely affected. Terms of trade will go against the farmer. You will see further farmer distress.
Okay, moving on, there's a question from multiple people. So this is from Rhythm Behel and also from a similar question from Parikshit Ghosh. Had demonetization not happened in 2016, would we be in a better position to handle this crisis? Did it undermine our resilience?
Almost unquestionably. There are two things here. The first is what's been built into my analysis, which is, had demonetization not happened, what I call the core momentum of the economy, which is really what the investment rate would determine, would be closer to about 7.5%. What I have assumed is 6%. The reality may in fact be lower than that, right? Now, if I had actually done the same analysis, not changing any other figure, just changing that figure from 6% up to 7.5%, we would have a V-shaped recovery. The reason you are not getting a V-shaped recovery is precisely because of that problem. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is, again, it really goes back to expectations. That post demonetization, there has been a huge amount of loss of confidence. And loss of confidence essentially means people are wary about going out and spending. Their need for precautionary savings go up, not down. So they will draw down their savings in the short run for survival purposes, but over the longer period, they will try to build up their precautionary savings as quickly as they can. And that adds another contractionary effect.
So, one interesting line of questioning from multiple people, from Pooja Sharma and from Abhi Dash. Let me paraphrase it and mix in a little bit of my own query on that. This migrant, this reverse migration has been really top of town, and so there's a question of whether and for how long will it impact the national labor market. In interviews, many of the migrants are saying that they're unwilling to come back given the what they've gone through. So one wonders how sticky or how permanent that is. But the question here is in terms of policy. Government sort of spend more in the rural areas, given that lots of people have gone back there, so through income generation, NREGA, etc., etc. But the downside of that is that the reverse migration then will be sticky, and urban industries will be starved of labor. Or do you think that there should be policies to make it attractive for these migrants to come back to the cities? So what should be the sort of policy outlook on this?
You know, this is difficult to say. As a country, we have had a very long history of trying to encourage higher levels of economic activity in rural areas to keep the migration down. Unfortunately, and this has been a credo of every government ever since I can remember. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked that well. Because at the end of the day, the agglomeration economies of urban areas are extremely strong. And the net result is migration is going to happen and will continue to happen. The point is that will this happen quickly enough for us to be able to recover our growth trajectory? Frankly, I think the one takeaway that the government should have from this particular experience is that the reason why people are afraid is because it's partly because of the disease itself. It's a fear of contracting the disease if they came back. But I think that's the lesser fear. I think the trauma that they went through during the lockdown and the fear that something similar may happen in the future again is what will hold them back. So what we do need is to allay that fear, which is we do need to have systems whereby migrants are encouraged to come and register themselves, and the central government and state governments working in conjunction assure them that their interests will be protected in the event such a occurrence happens one more time.
That's a tall order, isn't it? I mean,
it is a very tall order. But this is an opportunity. We really should have worked at this 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Okay, here's an interesting question from Rajesh Mohapatra. So the gist of the question is that there's we're talking about double-digit contraction, huge revenue losses for the government. So could this significantly undermine the government's ability to intervene? And in particular, could there be a widespread collapse of entitlements like right to food, etc., by stealth or otherwise? Right. So if the government really runs into deep deficits and huge debts, so that sort of this question gets at this tension between saving things today versus jeopardizing the future. So is there a prospect of the major entitlements getting affected in the long run?
Yes, there is. And the danger is primarily, and I think this is what his question really is, the danger comes from what is going to happen to state budgets. All of us have been focusing, I think, completely unjustifiably on the central budget. The critical element out here really is the state government budgets. And the big worry is that once all of this blows over, the state governments are going to be in a situation where their interest payments will be so much higher that it will have to eat into the other regular activities of the state, which includes health and education in particular. As far as things like right to food is concerned, at least right to food is supposedly a partnership between center and states. So center gives some, states do a top up on that. But primary health and primary education are entirely state subjects, and they will probably take a hit.
A very quick quantitative question. I should have asked it before because we were talking about NREGA and rural support. So, a question from Anadhar Deodhar: is the increased allocation under NREGA enough to give employment to returning migrants? Given the numbers we know of the returning migrants, and given the 40,000 crore allocation, extra allocation, is it enough to create jobs for returning migrants?
Well, that is difficult to answer, and it is difficult simply because the experience with NREGA has been that in good agricultural years, you've actually had very little demand for the NREGA works. And in a bad agricultural year, they spike. Now, from all indications, this is going to be a very good agricultural year. So what we can and should expect is that the stable rural demand for NREGA work will diminish, and then you will have the add-on which is coming from the reverse migrants. Now, how these numbers play out, I don't know whether it's possible to even work it out. But if, God forbid, the rains fail this year, then this will be nowhere near. We would then have to talk about near doubling of that. So at the moment, we are talking about roughly 1 lakh crores. NREGAs were 60,000 earlier and 40,000 more. We are talking about nearly 2 lakh.
So it's a quick follow-up question from Ashwini Kulkarni on the migrants issue. And again, a little bit of a quantitative issue here. If the reverse migration is sticky, if the migrants don't return for quite a while, then will there be a substantial upward pressure on urban wages? And couldn't it be in a strange way, a blessing in disguise for urban workers who have stayed back? I mean, the fact is that, it's Lewis kind of world, right? There's such a sea of surplus labor. It really lowers wages and living conditions in the cities. So couldn't there be a sort of brighter side to it in that sense? Better wages for urban workers.
Yes, but what you would then, I think, see is a growing inequality across different parts of the country. And the problem of managing the country as an integrated federal nation will become that much more difficult. Yes, it will be a benefit to the urban workers, perhaps, but what has also been happening, and I think Ashwini should know this, she's been working on it, is that over the last now nearly decade and a half, maybe even 2 decades, what we are seeing is an increase, a very sharp increase, in fact, of industry moving to rural areas. That's been happening already. All right. Now, what would may end up happening is that this would simply accelerate that process. So I'm not sure that the urban workers would necessarily benefit by as much as one may think.
Ultimately, every resource is mobile.
Absolutely, and capital more mobile than the rest.
Right. Let me sort of end on a global note again, sort of outward-looking note. So, drawing on a question which has been submitted and also something that I had in mind. So, there's a question from Akash Singh. There's this scrutinizing of investments from China, right? So we are also in a sort of military political situation with China, and then this whole pandemic situation. So let's say there could be a reset in relations with China. So Akash's question is, how will that affect the Indian startup ecosystem? Yes, there's a lot of linkages with China in terms of technology know-how inputs. Our pharmaceutical industry is very dependent on the APIs coming from China. Do you see that getting redesigned, or should it be redesigned? And also let me connect it to a broader question, which is that the Prime Minister has talked about. The major theme in the speech on the package was Atmanirbhar Bharat. That's in the name. Now, economists talking about it, often the take is that this is old wine, new bottle, this is protectionism, Swadeshi economics, what have you. But shouldn't we also, at the broadest level, also think about the nature of globalization, right? We have been talking about the inequality triggered by globalization, but now we are seeing, because of the interdependence, right? It has created a world which is interdependent but uncoordinated. One country goes into lockdown, others are open, so supply chains are affected, and then that country opens up. Like China, when China has opened up, now other countries are in lockdown, and Chinese are facing demand problems. So is this a time also to turn a little bit more inward for everyone, to have some local resilience, instead of this intensely globalized world, which is highly efficient but also highly vulnerable? It's interdependent, but it's uncoordinated. So what's your take on that broader question, but more narrowly, what led to this broader question? Akash is asking whether strained relations with China will affect our startups.
Well, as far as startups are concerned, much depends on which sector you're talking about. But I will come back to that, because in a sense, to make sense of what I'm going to be saying, I first have to answer Parikshit's larger question. I think the notion of self-reliance, we had sort of forgotten about one rather critical dimension, which was the notion of strategic importance. So every country treats agriculture as strategically important, because any hold up in that, and you can actually hold a country to ransom by blocking food supplies. I think what has become very clear, that pharmaceuticals are now as strategic as agriculture. Agriculture will kill you by starvation. Non-availability of pharmaceuticals will kill you by disease. Now, we went into, as Parikshit very rightly said, an uncoordinated globalization mode, where in the 1990s, we were producing about 80% of our APIs. Today, we import about 80% of our APIs, of which 60% comes from China. So I think there are selected areas where every country will have to take a call on building up domestic capacity. That is not a response to uncoordinated globalization. That is a strategic response. The response to the uncoordinated globalization is I don't think you can have coordinated globalization anyway. We've had all kinds of economic blocks coming into existence, and they don't get to agree on most things. So I think the strategic approach to that would really be sufficient level of diversification of your potential supply sources so that you will not be pulled down by very localized damage. So what you should be looking at is that companies and countries should be saying, I don't care if China produces 90% of this thing and I consume only 1%. I want to find other countries which can give this to me so that China's share comes down from 90% to maybe 60%. But there are enough alternative sources where this would happen. I think that is going to be the trend going forward, not just for countries. This is going to be true of large corporates as well, the multinationals. They are going to be looking at it in exactly the same way. Which then brings me to the question that was asked about what will happen to startups. This will actually help startups because if startups are then looking at those areas where multinationals are planning to diversify their supply bases, then they're going to get a huge boost. So I think it's not a bad situation for startups, but the time is not now. And in certain parts of the startup economy, there are going to be certain amount of problems, particularly because of this total dominance by China of electronic components.
Okay. As far as global coordination is concerned, I think we have a shining example which is still evolving, which is the EU, the European Union.
Yes, quite. Yes.
Thank you very much, Pronab, and thanks to all the participants who joined and spared us your time. It has been a fascinating discussion for me, and I've learned a lot from it. Once again, let me say that, in Ideas for India, we are doing extensive coverage of the COVID situation, so please visit our pages